I think disconnection is the greatest lie in the world, and that's causing a lot of issues in individualistic societies like our own.
Welcome to The Deal with Animals. I'm Marika Bell, anthrozoologist, CPDT certified dog trainer, and an animal myself. This is a podcast about the connection and interaction between humans and other animals. So this episode is a continuation of our Animals and the Divine series. In the past episodes of this series, we've really been seeing a pattern in many religions and belief systems about how animals and humans are kin. Whether we're talking about evolution or creator stories, animals keep coming up as being an integral part of the human experience. Now, Ben Stimpson is a psychotherapist who works with the queer community using a holistic approach to address historical, religious, and ancestral trauma. So where do animals come in? We're done dancing around the idea of animals as kin. Let's talk about our animal ancestors. In this episode, we're going to discuss animals as ancestors. We will clarify cultural appropriation, expand our concept of ancestor, and have a fascinating discussion into the complex relationship humans have with other animals and how to change our perspectives and perceptions of the world around us to become more empathetic. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. Ben is just so intelligent and insightful that I just want to use a highlighter all over the transcript. Speaking of the transcript, you can get a link to it in our show notes, where you will also find more info about Ben and a new section on the key moments in the episode. So before or after listening in, go ahead and check that out. And thank you for joining me today as we ask the question, what's the deal with animals? Welcome to the podcast. Please introduce yourself and share your pronouns.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. My name is Ben Stimpson. I go by he, they, them pronouns.
Thank you very much. And how about the cat on the bed behind you?
Yeah. And my cat Sky on the bed behind me. She's 16 years young, and she goes by she, they, them as well.
Great. Now, just to start out, why don't you share with us a story of your history, particularly of your earliest or childhood formative memories about your connection with animals?
Absolutely. So you can tell by my accent, it's kind of mixed. Although I'm living in Ontario, Canada right now, I was born in Wales, North Wales in the United Kingdom. And one of my very earliest memories, we lived out in the countryside. So we were surrounded by farms, but one of the most vivid memories was actually going and visiting one of the local zoos. There's a beautiful small zoo in a place called Chester, which is one of the oldest cities in England. And they had pachyderms. They had a herd of elephants. And I remember when I was about 4 years old, something like that, I went and saw an elephant for the first time. And I was a tiny little blonde-haired, little knobbly-kneed little kid, right? I was very small for my age. And I saw this massive elephant for the first time, and I was bewildered. I was amazed. It really cemented for me my love of elephants, that first introduction. And of course, I grew up, it was the era of Barbara, and a lot of the BBC television programs involved elephants. And I remember that night going home, and I could swear I could hear elephants calling from across the distance. You know, we were in the middle of the country, so that's one of my very first memories of a non-kind of domestic animal.
That's interesting. Did you know at the time that elephants can communicate long distances, or was that just a feeling that you had?
It was a feeling that I had. It was just one of those. It's one of those. I'm not sure if it's a constructed memory or if it's an actual memory, but I vividly remember like sitting in my little bed at the time and looking over at the window with the window open, and hearing the call of elephants. And we were like miles. It was about a 40-minute drive to the local zoo we went to. So that image of this huge, massive creature grunting and doing its thing and calling, very vivid in my memory.
So let's get into your work. You just recently released a book. So let's talk about that a little bit.
So I am a therapist up here in Ontario, Canada. I work a lot with narrative, and I work a lot with mostly Jungian and transpersonal style psychology. So images, spiritual folkloric images, and narrative images are things that I work a lot with clients. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I had a lot of time. All of my clients could no longer afford my services. And so we had a lot of time during lockdown. So I started to write a book. And up until that point, I had, for my own personal spirituality, I had been working a lot with ancestor work. A large part of the training that I took was in trauma and ancestral trauma, familial trauma. And one of the big projects we had was called a genogram. And genograms are a very specific style of genealogical trees that not only track familial connections, but also track information like addictions, subpersonalities, family cultures, and trauma. So that was really present in my mind as I was coming to finishing my training. I finished my training in September 2019. And then, of course, 6 months later, the pandemic hit. So I started sitting down and I wrote this book, Ancestral Whispers, A Guide to Building Ancestral Veneration Practices. I saw a need at that point because so many people were interested in working with their family and their family story. They didn't quite know how to do it without resorting to appropriative practices. And around that time, we had a lot of movies, Coco, for example, Pixar's Coco, that showed a spiritual approach to working with ancestor and ancestor story. And a lot of people in the communities that I work in, especially with spiritual psychotherapy, there is an interest in connecting with an individual's ancestors. But again, there was no way for people of a specific background, Western background, to connect. There's a lot of disconnection from older traditions, cultural traditions. And so I saw a need and I sat down and I wrote it. And the book evolved over the span of 8 months as I was writing it. And it was quite a journey.
So where does your work fall into the spirituality and religious spectrum?
Of course. So like my work as my book or my general work as a therapist?
I guess both.
So I would say that my psychotherapy work, we're using a spiritual approach, which is a holistic approach. When I'm working with a client, and I niche and work specifically with the queer community, I'm looking at the body, I'm looking at the mind, I'm looking at the spirit. So a lot of specifically religious trauma exists in my community. And so I might work around that religious trauma. I might work with a client to explore identity and self and come into connection with self through spiritual lenses. And really, that's a kind of a pompous way of saying holistic. So I'm looking at using meditation. I'm using spiritual frameworks to help explore with a client themselves. I'm also opening the door to them expressing and exploring themselves while talking about spirituality in general. So it isn't for me to give them a spiritual approach. Really, religion doesn't come into it very often. And even within that spiritual framework, it's a very kind of vaguely diverse grouping of things. When it comes to the book, what this is essentially 268 pages of a therapy session. So I'm going through using spiritual practice as a framework to bring the reader into connection with their family story, with themselves as a part of that family, as an extension of that family. We explore how they conceptualize the world around them. And really, it's about finding a place for themselves within a grander scheme and defining that grander scheme for themselves. So the book is really in two parts. I call it the thinky bit and the doey bit. The thinky bit is about, and that is technical terminology I have coined for the book.
Yeah.
But it's about exploring what is your worldview, and then how do you as an individual fit within that worldview? What is your relationship to that worldview? How do you find yourself and relate to others through that worldview? Really, it's about relationship. And then the doey bit is how do you then take that worldview and put that into a meaningful spiritual practice that is a lived experience for you? And how does that then inform the rest of your life and how you show up to your life? So it could be the development of little rituals that bring you into ground and centeredness. It can be how do you work with family stories, particularly the family stories that are related to trauma? How do you think about your great uncle who may have committed abuse in the family? How do you work with him as a figure within the family's sphere? How do you then connect with other parts of your identity through the family? So for a lot of North Americans, for example, one of the biggest issues right now, and for a long time, has been that disconnection from traditional family connections. There is this idea and the reality of being a settler on a colonized land. How do you, first of all, connect with landscape? How do you connect with the other beings in that landscape, including animals, which we'll talk about soon? And also then, how do you relate to that landscape, all of the ancestors connected to that landscape, the other communities of indigenous people in that landscape, while also connecting with ancestry on the other side of the planet? So specifically, mostly people of European background. In the kind of the field that I work with, there's a strong connection with that ancestral identity. I'm a Scots-Irish person. Therefore, my homeland is in Scotland. In Ireland, I have this strong spiritual connection to this place I may have never actually gone to, while also perhaps ignoring the landscape that you're on now. And so how do you then bring that into alignment? By connecting with that ancestry, honoring that ancestry through a spiritual lens, while also relating to and honoring the landscape that you're on now and all of the myriad relationships that exist on it.
Let's get to how animals fit into that. What role do they play in this ancestral relationship landscape?
So to answer that question, I think we have to look really at what is the rationale for an ancestral veneration practice. So we're used to seeing religion as being a set of rituals, a set of beliefs, a cultural sphere that is dedicated to a deity, whether it be Jesus Christ, whether it be the God of Israel, whether it be Vishnu, whoever it is, right? But when you look at kind of lived religion around the world, you have these levels of religiosity and spirituality and spiritual traditions that usually lie outside of religion. And that is connecting to other beings in the cosmos, ancestor veneration being one of them. So the ancestors, this mass group of humans who we emerge from, that we have a relationship with, in most traditions around the world, you see kind of a second tier of religiosity directed towards them, whether it be understanding them as spiritual beings in the landscape or as being kind of intercessors connecting you with God. So how animals come into that is that in most traditional cultures, when you really look at them, animals are incorporated into that worldview as kindred. So if we look at many traditional indigenous North American cultures, animals are regarded as kindred, as cousins, sometimes as brothers, siblings in relationship. And so in developing ancestral practices, we're not just looking at human ancestors, we're also looking at animal ancestors, expanding that concept of ancestor, expanding that concept of personhood. And so when it comes to this, I would say European background, we have those relationships already. We have many different cultures, many communities where animals played a role, whether it be mythological or whether it be taken literally, as being ancestors. In many places in Ireland and the Scottish Islands, you have communities that are said to be descended from creatures that came out of the sea or from the seal folk. And so those communities have a strong relationship to those animals and the reverence of those animals as spiritual figures and as kin in the landscape. That's where it starts to come in. I think a second part of this is we live in a very different urban world now. The majority of us live in cities or suburbs, and the majority of, I would say, listeners here are probably sitting comfortably in a home, and you may have a pet, but you wouldn't have livestock living with you. If you look at the vast majority of human culture around the world, livestock, animals who are assisting on farms in agricultural cultures, they're living in very close quarters. And so where we often see ancestor work coming in is the inclusion of those animals as kin, as members of the household when they've passed away. And so I think kind of a secondary piece to that is understanding animals not as a secondary tier divorced from us, but as being part of our worldview and part of our community.
Just a quick break to remind you that if you're participating in or organizing a conference that relates to the connection between humans and other animals, we should chat. TDWA is covering up to 3 conferences a year. That means we would interview speakers and organizers about the conference goals, content, and takeaways. This is a great way to add value to both your attendees and speakers. So, if you want to promote your conference using this podcast to reach your audience in animal studies, advocacy, and care, then go to thedealwithanimals.com and schedule a free consult with me, your anthrozoologist adventurer, Marika Bell, or reach out on Twitter at TDWA Podcast. So how do you approach this idea of, okay, when somebody says, oh, such and such is my spirit animal? Or even, oh gosh, the one I get all the time because I worked with big cats is people would always have and want to tell you about their connection with tigers or lions or these animals of majesty, even though they really don't have any kind of direct connection to those animals in terms of their ethnic background or where they're from or the interactions that they've ever had with an animal like that.
On the surface level, I think we're looking at a cultural phenomenon which is a misunderstanding of what spirit animals actually are in indigenous cultures, taken up by the popular media as almost a joke, right? But I think on a deeper level in that, what I think we're seeing is individuals are seeing an aspect of themselves reflected in their perception of the animal. And so then placing, what's the word? Placing that animal on a higher tier of reverence because they're actually seeing aspects of themselves in that. So I would say if we were to bring it to my specialty working with in psychotherapy world, I would then be very curious working with clients. Well, what is it about this animal that attracts you? What is it about this animal that you relate to? And use that relationship, even if it's just in a mental state, for a deeper exploration of self. On a spiritual level, I would be cautious because I would wonder how much of that is cultural appropriation. I would be very interested to clarify with that individual kind of what they're meaning by that. Because sometimes we have this kind of culturally appropriated idea in the Western world of totemism and these horrendous misunderstandings of traditional indigenous cultures. Where I live right now, I live quite close by to 2 bands of Chippewa, of Anishinaabe people. And people will, I think non-Indigenous people look at all Indigenous people as having the same traditions. And I think it's very important to understand how many different cultures exist in North America here. So I would be very interested to understand from that person, well, what do you mean by that? And then explore that relationship. And with tigers specifically, tigers have been around in Western culture for a very long time. And a lot of mythological associations have been placed onto them. And so culturally, we have this idea of a tiger, which does not necessarily bear resemblance to the actuality of a tiger, right?
Yes, yeah, very true. Yeah, if they only knew how much they would just like to spray you in the face. So then how do we do this, right? If this is something that people feel a strong connection with, they want to explore this idea, how would they go down that path without doing it in a way that also entails misappropriation?
No, absolutely. Well, when I've studied this myself, when we look at the world traditions generally, and I mean, there will always be exceptions to rules, absolutely. But when you look at the majority of the world's traditions, at least that I've seen, there is always a worldview with animals connected, whether animals are symbolic, whether they are seen as kin, whether or not they are as part of the family, right? And so I think in some ways it's about understanding culturally the relationship between animals and humans, but also then understanding the individual level. And I think the individual level, as I said, it comes back to, I think, that personal relationship. The appropriative piece, I think my own cat has a lot to say on this too. You can hear it in the background. I think it depends on what the individual is looking at gaining. If somebody is looking at incorporating, if a Western person is looking to incorporate animals into their own practice, then I think that they need to be very intentional with how they are building that for themselves. They have to be very intentional that they are not taking on the traditions and rituals of other people just because they look cool. But I think also in a way that is honoring of the animal. Particularly, and I'm speaking for my own spiritual communities here, there is an increasing interest in using animals. I think there's an interest in using animal pieces and animal kind of magic. And unfortunately, many times those are individuals who are buying from taxidermy companies or who are buying from individuals who are killing these animals to use those parts. So I feel like, again, you have to tread carefully. You have to understand kind of what are you hoping to gain out of it? And at the end of the day, how respectful is it to the actual animals that you're trying to connect with? I think also looking at the sources of the information that you're gaining from. So there is a book by Ted Andrews, which is horrendously appropriative. And it is essentially a whole book about what do animals mean in your life? When you see an animal in your life, what is the symbolic meaning of that? Now, myself, I think that can be taken a bit too far. I think that we can often project a lot onto animals, and absolutely. And I think that becomes then a dangerous piece because then it becomes an egotistical thing. So it's a difficult question to answer, to be honest. I think there's a lot of moving parts to it.
Yeah, it reminds me of there was a pack of tarot cards a friend of mine had when we were kids, and it was
Mhm.
all animals, right? And you were
Mhm.
supposed to pick 7 cards or whatever it was, and those would be your spirit guides. And it was all very, when I think about it now, cringy, misappropriation, like, ugh. I mean, I guess the deck was made in the Pacific Northwest, if I remember correctly. It was all Pacific Northwest animals, and that's where we lived. And so it wasn't like it was like grabbing animals randomly from, it's trying to stay within this area. But at the same time, I think about it and I just think, okay, that even, especially as a game, potentially being, what's the word I'm looking for? Ignorant, I guess,
Yes.
about another culture and what we were doing with that. But in a fairly innocent way, right? We didn't really
Yes.
understand any of that. So how do we or how would you suggest, how do you suggest your clients and in the book how people do go about creating this connection in a way that is meaningful?
Absolutely. So the whole book is about relationship. That's really the pivot word of the entire book. And while the majority of the book is about relating to your ancestors, your human biological ancestors, there's a lot in there about connecting with affinity ancestors, characters, fictional characters. There's this wonderful concept by T.M. Luhrmann, who is an anthropologist and a writer on religious studies in the UK. I think in the UK or the East Coast, somewhere in the world. And they have this idea of a paracosm. And paracosm is the created worlds that children can easily construct and dwell in and live in and enter into. And when you look at great fantasy literature, like The Lord of the Rings, like Beatrix Potter, like Narnia, those constructed realities are paracosms. We enter into those worlds. And so I think it's about looking again at your needs and looking at the intentions behind what you're looking at connecting with. And so in the book, I talk about how does then those various other forms of ancestor relate to you? How are you relating to them? How are you growing from them and that relationship with them? And so with animals, it can be seen in a very similar way. You started this conversation with what is my very earliest memory of an animal? Well, elephants became a big thing throughout my life. I've always loved elephants, even though I've only ever seen them in zoos. But as creatures in the landscape that I don't exist on, they're a very mental form. And yet, a lot of the fictional characters I've looked up to, like Babar, for example, grew me and influenced my development. And so honoring animals in that way as ancestors, but also I would say then in connecting with the landscape around you, learning about the other realities around us. we live in a very human-centric world. We live in cities, towns, villages, we drive cars, we're in human sphere, right? Oftentimes the animal world doesn't come into it unless we invite them in. I think that there's a lot of ways that we can learn about the world around us and then how our world is affected, our slice of the world is affected by looking at the animal kingdom. And so I would say for anybody who is interested, start to pay attention to the world around you. Start to pay attention to the other worlds around you and how they're influencing your life, how they've influenced your life up till now, right? Something I've always laughed at. I grew up in the country. I grew up in a little tiny town of about 500 people. And then the next closest town was 8,000. And I actually grew up very close to where they filmed Schitt's Creek. So if you imagine Schitt's Creek, very similar landscape, exact same kind of rural country. And when I moved to Toronto for school, I met people who had never left Toronto, had never left the urban environment. They had no idea where their food came from. They had no idea of the animals that were living in their urban landscape. They had no idea. And when they started to learn about those things, they were shocked because it was a shock to their system. So I would say, I think I'm really kind of all over the place with this answer, but I would say become aware of the other realities around you and how you can relate to them. And then how does that understanding influence who you are and who you might become?
I mean, it gives people a place to start when they're trying to think about what is this connection that I have with animals that feels spiritual and yet maybe isn't reflected within my current religion or my current spiritual practice. How do I include that important part of my understanding of my relationship with the spiritual world?
Absolutely. And I would say, on that note, I think so much of how people conceptualize animals spiritually tends to be a human lens projecting onto animals. That's been going on for thousands of years. In medieval times, if you opened up a bestiary, majority of information in a medieval bestiary filled with animals wasn't actual animal behavior. It was what the animals were symbolic of. And so for years and years and years, the idea of what an animal behavior was came actually from what humans were symbolically projecting onto them. For example, I've always loved this one. So beavers they do exist in Europe. People don't realize this in North America, but beavers are actually existing in Europe. Same with moose, right? So for the longest time, there was a huge amount of folklore around beavers, particularly of testicles, because the idea, it's very strange, I know, but I love this. So there was a belief that if you were to run after a beaver, it would chop off its testicles and throw it at you. And that had a lot of spiritual significance and kind of cultural significance. The reason for that was because the testicles particularly held a certain musk that was used in perfume making. And so that, apart from the pelt, the testicles were in high demand. Now, in reality, we know that beavers are not running around throwing their testicles at humans.
No, it gives a whole new meaning to the term beaver bombing.
Exactly.
My goodness.
Right? But if you're in a culture where that is a belief, and that belief is perpetuated again and again and again, if you see a beaver in the wild, you might expect it to act that way, and it doesn't, then it might confuse you. So I think, again, we have to understand kind of there's a difference between the lived reality of animals in the world and then how humans conceptualize and throw onto them what we expect them to be and our beliefs around them, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Wow. In this podcast series, we've done so much talking about the connection between animals and the divine, and what keeps coming up, even in episodes not directly related to spirituality, is the idea of animals as kin. So how could someone use Ben's new book to get in touch with their literal animal kin ancestors? I think that what I've developed here is a framework for spiritual practitioners. I know that many of the listeners here are in the academic world and they're coming from an anthropological point of view. And so what I was very interested in with this book was not giving readers who are there to augment their spirituality and their practices a practice to do. The book is not telling you how to do your religion or your spirituality, however way you define that. It's really about getting you to think about your relationships.
And oftentimes with ancestor work, we have a very narrow view of what ancestors actually are. We tend to think of them only in terms of blood relations, instead of the vastness of what could potentially be ancestor. So part of why I really love coming onto your show and talk about animals in this way is that idea of expanding the concept of ancestor. In the same way that we can expand the concept of spiritual being, we can expand the concept of neighbor, we can expand the concept of community to be inclusive of all sorts of different other elements, right, that we wouldn't necessarily think of. So one of the major pieces is, and the readership of this out through Llewellyn Worldwide, which is more New Age, neo-paganism, shamanic, I hate that word, but it's what the genre is. The majority of them are looking at kind of a polytheistic, animistic approach to relating to the world around them. And so I talk about what would it be like to see the sky or the cosmos as an ancestor, because all of the pieces of your body come from the stars. What would it be like to see the sea as an ancestor, knowing that our precursors, ancestors, came from those depths, right? I think a lot of people also don't necessarily think of human evolution in their ancestor work. There's a wonderful, hilarious meme that I love going around, and it's very stereotypical. I hope I'm not going to get in trouble by anybody by saying this, but very stereotypical kind of New Age individual, feathers in the hair and banging a drum. And it says, "Ancestors, guide me with your wisdom." And it goes down to an animal from about 50 million years ago, and it's flopping about on the seashore.
Yeah, people they don't think that far back, do they?
No. Well, and I think that's cultural. I think
yes.
we've grown up in, at least Western society has grown up in a way that we can't see the theory of evolution as being a real thing, because the Bible, of course, says 6,000 years ago, man was created as he is or as she is. And that is that. But when we look at kind of the journey of humanity evolved from the animal kingdom. And I think that is also a big piece too, is in understanding that many of the traits that we think of as purely human, such as sentience, such as sapience, such as tool making, such as dreaming, has now been seen in many other forms of animal. So it really begs the question then, how do we relate to animals like squid, for example, which have been shown and proven to have very complex thinking skills and to also dream? How do you relate to an animal that previously you thought was beneath you, knowing that they can dream? Not in a woo-woo sort of sense, in a very literal sense. How do you relate to an animal that is intelligent, like cetaceans, that you know is intelligent and could be as intelligent as you, maybe at a different age level, but still as intelligent as you? And I think that is how people can relate to animals in a spiritual sense on a greater level, by learning about them in reality and then seeing how we can connect on a spiritual level in that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
If there was a book that you could gift to all of the listeners, besides your own, what would that book be?
Hands down, I would say Braiding Sweetgrass. It is one of my absolute favorites.
Beautiful book. Yeah. I finished that one this year, and I actually listened to it on audio while I was in my car, and oh my gosh, I just love her voice. Can she just be like my second mom? Speaking of ancestors, like she just, I could listen to her talk all day. She needs to write more books, and it's just everything about it is just, it's beautiful.
It really changed the way I was thinking about the world around me. And she speaks about that idea of indigenization as opposed to becoming indigenous. Indigenization is forming your own relationship to whatever landscape you're on in a way that is affirming of previous and other relationships without destroying those relationships, and respecting all of the people in the community by expanding the concept of personhood and people. My cat is a person. I respect her. The crow crowing in the woods is a person in my world. And I respect their right, not only their right to be in the woods, but also to sometimes be in my space too, just as I'm going into their space. So I love her. I mean, she's an amazing storyteller. And I think she bridges the academic botany field and the spiritual field very well, bridging those two perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just an amazing read. And it's really one of those books that it's a life-changing book. I think for most people
Yes,
who read it, it will change your perspective on the world around you and your life, and not in a you have to think differently sort of way now that you have this information, but really internal understanding of the world is just different after you've
absolutely.
read that book.
Absolutely. I hope that my book can do even a sliver of what that book did for me, but we'll see. But again, it's changing paradigms. It's changing how you think and perceive the world around you that I think is important. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great one. So, Ben, what is the deal with animals?
what is the deal with animals? I know you asked me that to think about that weeks ago. I've been trying to think about that. What is the deal with animals? I would say that the deal with animals is that we are as uncomfortable with animals as we love them. We're uncomfortable with animals because they are outside of our control. And so we often make animals into monsters. We make them into foes. We make them into whatever we need them to be in order for us to feel comfortable. And I would say that is why we are so enamored with animals, why we're so fearful. Yeah.
Very ambivalent.
It's a very ambivalent question, though, to be honest.
Well, you've got me there. Yes, I suppose it is. But to what you've been saying all along, we're all related.
Yes.
It's not that there are one set of animals. I mean, sure, there's one set of animals that we're, I suppose, genetically closer to than others. But, how close is important enough, right?
Absolutely.
At one point, there was a genetic ancestor that we had with just about everything on the earth. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's all ancestors.
It is all ancestors. It's all family, right? We have this very strange, speaking about human ancestors, we have this very strange idea of individual families existing in communities. And when you actually look and think about how genealogy works, the further back you go, the more your individual family's story becomes the story of entire continents of people, right? If you go back only 1,000 years, the majority of the people in a certain location country, region, continent will be related to you. And so your story becomes subsumed into the story of life. And I think that also ties in with the question. Our human story is intricately connected to the story of life. And so my cat might seem very different to me, but we're very connected. And our family story goes back 65 million years to our common ancestor with that cat. So she's a cousin to me, even though very distant. And so then I think we have to stop thinking in such narrow terms. And when we stop thinking in such narrow terms, we start to look and respect animals in a different way. And I think then we start to actually respect their role in our lives and our roles in their lives too.
Yeah, that's such an important point. I think, again, in that idea of changing people's perspective about how they interact with the world, if you're driving and you think of everybody else in the cars as potentially your children, say your children are at school that
Yes.
day, but they're going on a field trip, like maybe they're in that car, maybe they're in that bus. If you have even this made up idea that a family member or relative could be in any of these cars, or maybe they're in all of these cars, you're going to
Mhm.
drive really differently and
Very
treat those
difficult.
drivers very differently
Yes.
than you would if you're seeing them as a car. That's a
Yeah,
car, or that's in bleep that just cut me off. Like it's just a very different way that you're going to even approach your driving when you look
absolutely.
at the world that way.
Absolutely. You really do. You become more careful, you become more mindful, you become more introspective. And I think your empathy grows because of that. I think disconnection is the greatest lie in the world, and that's causing a lot of issues in individualistic societies like our own. We tend to become very lonely. Our mental health issues are on the increase because of that loneliness and that disconnection. Friends of mine, they started off gridding about 10 years ago. They moved up into the middle of nowhere, Ontario, They were living in a place called Hamilton, which is close to Toronto, and they were sous chefs in a very high stressful industry. And then they decided they just didn't want to do that anymore. So they went and they bought 9 acres of land, and they went and off-gridded. They built their own farm. And when you talk to them now about the animals that they raise on their farm, because those animals are also their food too, they're also their equipment, they talk about them like family. They talk about them with empathy. They talk about them with respect. And they have a very beautiful tradition. They call it the mother tree. And it's an old stump in the middle of their property. There's a huge, big, open hollow in it. And that hollow contains the skulls of all of the horses and all of the plow oxen that they've had on the farm, placed there in honor when those animals have passed away. And not only in honor of the service that they provided for them, but also to keep them in the family. That is a sacred place for this couple to go to and remember their horses. I think they've gone through 2 horses now in the time that they've been there. And to remember the intimate times that they've had with them, because they're seeing these creatures every single day. They're working alongside these creatures, not only to feed themselves, but also to feed the other animals on the farm. It becomes a relationship and a living relationship. And I think that if we saw the rest of the world in that way, we may not necessarily be living close to somebody in the next car over, but we're connected to them if we know it or not. And so the empathy that we have for each other when we see others in that way grows. And I think it makes us all kinder.
Thank you for taking the time and coming on to the Deal with Animals podcast today. It was really great talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It was wonderful to talk to you. And I hope you have a good rest of your season.
That was the author of the new book, Ancestral Whispers, out September 8th, 2023 through Llewellyn Worldwide. Ben is on social media, and you can find him at benstimpson.com. And remember, for key moments and for more info on Ben, take a peek at the show notes. I'm in the process of redesigning them, and I'd love feedback on usefulness, aesthetic, and content. And now a quick shout out to our newest listeners in Uganda. I'd love to hear about what brought you to the podcast and, of course, your favorite episodes. Thank you for joining me as we try to answer the question, what's the deal with animals? So what do you think is the deal with animals? If you enjoyed this show and have any questions or comments about this episode or about the podcast in general, go to thedealwithanimals.com and leave me a message. I'm your host, Marika Bell. I'd like to thank Kai Stranskoff for the theme music and Natasha Matsar for help with editing. You can see links to guest book recommendations, as well as their websites and affiliated organizations in the show notes and at thedealwithanimals.com. This podcast was produced on both historical tribal land of the Snoqualmie and Quinault Indian Nations. Deal with Animals is part of the iRoar Animal Podcast Network.